Hello. If there's one thing I've learned since I've been on the internet, beginning in about 2001 or so, had a fairly late start in getting on the internet and becoming exposed to the World Wide Web. But if there's one thing I've learned, there's absolutely nothing that people won't argue about, and there's also very little that people won't say. People will get into the worst arguments about almost anything on the internet. There are a lot of things that people will say. Well, I'll put it this way. People will say almost anything about anything on the internet. I'm not that type, but a lot of people are, and I've discovered that over the years. And one of the biggest and most enduring arguments that I've ever encountered on the internet, believe it or not, is this: should people wear shoes in the house or in other people's homes? It's a tremendous area of disagreement, and people actually do get angry with each other about this issue. In the United States, there's a subculture of people who don't wear shoes in the house. It's very small and very scattered, but not really the norm in most of the United States. In Canada, shoes off indoors is apparently almost a universal rule. In South America and Central America, it's not a rule. You don't have a lot of people taking shoes off in the house on a regular basis as soon as they get home or anything like that. In Australia, not really an issue. People don't really do it there. Asia, we all know that's a shoes off culture for inside. Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, Spain, Portugal, France, Greece, Italy, and the microstates in that area are not really shoes off cultures, but once you get into Central Europe and a lot of Northern Europe, you find cultures that are adamantly shoes off. Britain is a dichotomy. You have some yes and some no, and adamantly on both sides. So what is my stand on this particular issue? Should shoes be worn in the house? Incidentally, there's a blog that you can find on the internet called Shoes Off at the Door. And this fellow in England has made a career out of arguing that people should take the shoes off in the house and in other people's homes, and that shoes should just never be worn indoors. There's a blog, and he's been running this blog for multiple years. It's a huge issue with him. Well, my stand on it is like this, and I'll get into the particulars in just a minute. Here in the desert Southwest, it's sandy and dusty, and what you have most of the time is either dust or the kind of condition that sand gets in when it gets wet. And it is helpful. You can keep the carpets and floors clean by taking your shoes off inside the house, so that's a benefit. It's also a more comfortable thing to do. Shoes are not really necessary in the house. I don't wear them inside the house most of the time. I usually get rid of the shoes as soon as I get home. But what about other people? Well, with regard to visitors, I don't have a super strict rule that applies to everybody all the time under every circumstance, because that's a little bit cumbersome. I don't want piles of shoes at the door. I don't want first-time visitors or unusual visitors to be unnecessarily uncomfortable, and that's the case with a lot of times with people. So here, shoes off in the house is kind of the norm, but it's not a super strict requirement. The obvious benefits are that my carpets do stay cleaner. It's a more comfortable environment. There's not any tracking allergies in the house on footwear and things like that. The reason for not being super strict, well, first of all, it makes people feel extremely vulnerable to have to get rid of their footwear anytime they go in a strange house, and that's just a vulnerable feeling, and people get the impression that it's being too pushy and too aggressive, and it's not a thing that is commonly done in the Southwest. But the most important reason probably for not being extremely strict on this issue is there is no substantial risk of bacterial infection from people wearing shoes in the house. Unless you're planning on eating off the floor, it's just not that big a risk. And there are decades of evidence to prove this in areas of the country where people do routinely wear shoes in and out of the house. There's also this business of if you're going to be coming and going a lot it's kind of cumbersome to stop, take off your shoes and put them back on every time you go in and out of the house. So the rule that I have here is not super strict. I think shoes off in the house is generally a pretty good policy, but I don't feel that it's a super strict rule that should be applied to everybody all the time. I think that's a little bit pushy and a little bit aggressive. And I know some people say, well, if it's part of the culture, okay, but then when you try to define what is culture, the best definitions that I can seem to come up with are that culture are things that we do just because we do them, because it's always been that way. So is culture necessarily a reason for any particular practice? I don't know. But here's something you should keep in mind about any house rule that you impose wherever you live. You can impose whatever house rules you want wherever you happen to live. That's true. You know, if it's your place, it can be your house and your rules. But that is sort of a two-way street, because if people find your rules, whatever it is you require or prohibit, onerous, then you're likely to sit at home alone. A lot of times people may limit their contact with you if you do something that they especially don't like or makes them uncomfortable or whatever. So house rules can in fact be a two-way street. My take on this business of should you wear shoes in the house, should you allow them to be worn in your house, is no, I usually don't wear them here. I usually take them off when I get here, and usually in socks or barefoot in the house. You know, shoes are not necessary indoors, but it's not a requirement that I'm going to put on other people. It causes people to feel vulnerable. It causes people to be put upon. It can be inconvenient to be taking them on and taking them off and putting them on all the time. Now, you know, part of the regular crowd, they usually do lose the shoes at the door or shortly thereafter. But that's not something that I'll impose on first-time people or people who are not likely to be here. And the fact is, there are not that many people in and out of this house anyway. It tends to be the close circle of friends, sometimes the relatives that I have to let in sometimes. I'm not a big fan of bio families for reasons, but it's generally just a small number of people who ever come here. And, you know, people who are here for once only, or, you know, they're not regular or nothing like that. That's not something I want to impose. But most people, if they're regular, if they're part of the inner crowd, pretty soon they're going to stop wearing the footwear in the house because it's not necessary, and you can be in a comfortable environment here and all that. So my take on this tends to be fairly easy going. Now, what about other places? Well, I don't mind, you know, whatever you want at your place. If I'm ever to visit you in a home or office or anything like that, whatever you want, fine with me. But as far as coming to my place, it's more of an easygoing kind of environment. And, you know, if you ever have reason to come here or start becoming a regular or anything like that, in any case, you're going to find a welcoming and comfortable environment, and not one where you're put on the spot and made to feel uncomfortable or anything like that. And probably that's going to end up not wearing footwear in the house because it's not necessary. And so that's my approach, the easy-going one. I think that is the one that works the best and makes everybody the happiest. And, you know, visitors here, I don't want to be under any kind of stress. I want it to be a happy and welcoming environment. So whatever you want to do, basically fine most of the time. And that's my take on this huge issue. Should shoes be worn in the house? I'd rather they kind of not be most of the time here, but it's not a strict rule. There are fairly common exceptions. And that's my take on the issue of shoes in the house.